There are moments in professional sports when someone decides that silence is no longer an option, when the gap between what the public has been told and what actually happened inside a building becomes wide enough that a person with real credibility, real experience, and a real professional reputation at stake decides that the accurate version of events needs to be on the record. Jim Schwartz just had one of those moments. The former Cleveland Browns defensive coordinator, one of the most respected defensive minds in the entire NFL, sat down for an exclusive interview and broke his silence. And what he said, what he revealed about the internal dynamics of that Cleveland Browns organization, is not the kind of thing you file away as interesting background noise. It is confirmation. It is a first-hand account from someone who was physically inside that building when the decisions were being made, who had a front-row seat to the organizational priorities, the culture, and the true competitive intentions of a franchise that has been sending signals for months that something is deeply wrong at its core. And now, those signals have a voice attached to them. A credible, experienced, 33-year NFL veteran voice that the Cleveland Browns organization cannot dismiss, cannot spin, and cannot pretend doesn't matter. This is not a minor story. This is not a disgruntled former employee venting frustration to get attention. Jim Schwartz is not that kind of person and has never been that kind of person. Men with his professional credentials and his coaching pedigree do not casually break organizational silence. They do not sit down for exclusive interviews and start pulling back the curtain on internal dynamics without having thought through every word, every implication, and every consequence of going public. When someone like Jim Schwartz decides to speak, it is because the alternative, allowing a distorted or incomplete narrative to define his departure, his legacy, and his professional standing inside that organization, has become less acceptable than the discomfort of putting the real story on the record. That decision alone, before a single word of the interview is even analyzed in depth, tells you something enormous about what went on inside the Cleveland Browns building. It tells you that what Schwartz experienced was significant enough, troubling enough, inconsequential enough that he is no longer willing to let it stand without his account attached to it. And when you place that account alongside everything else that has been happening around this franchise, the picture that emerges is one that every single person who cares about this team, every fan, every observer, every person who has invested hope in the direction of this organization needs to look at clearly and honestly. So let's do exactly that. Let's look at it all, from the beginning. To understand why Jim Schwartz breaking his silence carries the weight that it does, you first have to understand who Jim Schwartz actually is and what he built in Cleveland. Because if you haven't been paying close attention to the defensive side of the ball over the last few years, you might not fully grasp the magnitude of what this man accomplished inside that organization, and why his departure represents a loss that goes far beyond just losing a good coach. Jim Schwartz arrived in Cleveland and immediately began constructing something that the NFL hadn't seen in that city in a very long time: a genuinely elite, statistically dominant, historically significant defense. Not good, not solid, not respectable, elite. The kind of defense that opponents game planned around for weeks in advance and still couldn't solve. The kind of defense that made quarterbacks visibly uncomfortable from the very first series of a game. The kind of defense that, when you look at the numbers, makes you stop and read them twice because you're not sure you're seeing correctly the first time. Over 3 consecutive seasons in Cleveland, the Browns' defense under Jim Schwartz ranked number 1 in the entire NFL in defensive efficiency, number 1 in expected points allowed, number 1 in total first downs allowed, number 1 in total yards surrendered, number 1 in yards per play, number 1 in total passing yards against, number 1 in third down efficiency, number 1 in fourth down efficiency, number 1 in pressure rate, number 1 in time pressure rate, number 1 in tackles for loss, number 1 in 3-and-outs forced. They were second in sack rate, second in short yardage defense, and top 4 in total DVOA.
They finished in the top 10 in pass breakups, interceptions, and forced fumbles. And perhaps the single most jaw-dropping statistical achievement of that entire run, 45 consecutive games without allowing 300 passing yards. The next closest team during that same stretch managed 23. The NFL record is 52. Jim Schwartz's Cleveland defense was sitting at 45 and climbing before everything fell apart.
Read those numbers again. Read them slowly, because what they represent is not a flash in the pan, not a one-year statistical anomaly that gets smoothed out when the sample size grows. 3 years of sustained, consistent, historically dominant defensive performance against some of the most dangerous offensive weapons and offensive minds in the modern NFL. Against Lamar Jackson, against Joe Burrow, against Aaron Rodgers, in one of the single toughest divisions in professional football, where every single week presents a different challenge and a different offensive system that your defense has to solve on a short week of preparation. And Schwartz and his units solved them over and over and over again at a level that put that defense in the conversation with the greatest defensive units of the modern era. And Schwartz himself was clear about why 3 years of consistency meant more to him than any single season number. He talked about a coaching mentor of his, Gunther Cunningham, a man who coached in the NFL for decades and who used to emphasize that 1 year of success means almost nothing. Anyone can be a flash in the pan. What separates the truly great from the temporarily good is 3 years of consistency. Because over 3 years, the injuries even out, the strength of schedule evens out, the personnel turnover evens out, and what you're left with is a true measure of a coaching staff's ability to develop players and put a system on the field that works at the highest level, regardless of the variables surrounding it. Jim Schwartz not only understood that philosophy, he lived it in Cleveland. He proved it with results that are sitting in the statistical record of the NFL for anyone who cares to look. And through all of it, at the absolute center of everything that defense did and everything it became was one player, one singular generational talent whose production and whose impact on that defensive unit was unlike anything Cleveland fans had seen in decades. Miles Garrett, the most dominant edge rusher of his generation, the man who was, under Schwartz's system and with the schematic and structural support that Schwartz built around him, operating at the absolute peak of his already extraordinary abilities. And the story of what Schwartz built in Cleveland cannot be told without telling the story of what he helped Miles Garrett become. There is a moment that Jim Schwartz described in his interview that every person who loves football needs to hear, because it captures not just a statistical milestone, not just a record being broken, but the human side of what Schwartz built in Cleveland and what made that defensive unit so much more than just a collection of talented players running good schemes. Miles Garrett was chasing history. He was closing in on Jerry Rice's all-time NFL sack record, a record that had stood as one of the most untouchable marks in professional football, a record that belonged to a player so legendary that his name alone carries the weight of an entire era of the game. And as Garrett got closer and closer to that mark, as the moment of history began to feel real and tangible rather than abstract, Schwartz was thinking not just about the football side of it, not just about the schematic adjustments and the matchups and the game planning, but about making sure that when the moment happened, it happened right. Jerry Rice was on the sideline. Calvin Johnson, who had broken his own record earlier in what Schwartz described as a moment that was improperly handled by officials, winding a clock during a 2-minute drill and preventing the proper celebration, was also present. Garrett's parents were there. The stage was set for something that transcended a regular season football game. And with about 10 minutes left in that game, Miles Garrett still didn't have the sack. 10 minutes. The record within reach, history on the line, and the moment hadn't arrived yet. Schwartz admitted that he was getting ready to go to Garrett on the sideline and tell him something that made him laugh telling it,
that he didn't care if Garrett went offside 10 times in a row, he was going to jump the snap count on every single play until that sack happened. That's how much the moment mattered. That's how invested Schwartz was, not just in the tactical execution, but in making sure his player, his guy, the centerpiece of everything that defense had been built around, got his moment. Fortunately, it didn't come to that. Garrett made the sack on his own, against Joe Burrow, in a moment that Schwartz described as perfectly appropriate because Burrow had been one of Garrett's most productive matchups over those 3 seasons together. The Browns' defense had solved Joe Burrow better than any other team in the NFL over that stretch, largely because of the pressure that Garrett generated and the coverage that the system built around him provided.
And when it happened, when Garrett got that record-breaking sack and the moment of history arrived, the players picked him up on their shoulders, they carried him off the field, and Schwartz, watching it happen, saw something that went beyond football statistics and defensive rankings and draft capital and organizational philosophy. He saw how much those players were rooting for Garrett, how genuine and spontaneous the celebration was, how real the connection was between a defensive unit and its anchor. That's not something you manufacture. That's not something you scheme up in a film room. That kind of team chemistry, that kind of genuine investment in each other's success is built over years of working together under a coaching staff that creates the right environment for it to develop. Jim Schwartz created that environment in Cleveland, and then the Cleveland Browns organization decided that wasn't worth keeping. Here is where the story turns. Here is where what seemed like a successful, functional, historically productive football operation began to crack in ways that now, looking back with everything that has since come to light, were more significant than anyone outside that building fully understood at the time. The Cleveland Browns made a change at head coach. That much is public record, and when they did, they faced a decision that organizations face with varying degrees of thoughtfulness and varying degrees of fairness to the people whose careers are directly affected by it. They had a defensive coordinator who had just produced 3 consecutive years of the most dominant defensive football in the NFL. 3 years of #1 rankings across virtually every meaningful defensive metric, 3 years of building and developing and maximizing the players on that roster to levels they hadn't previously reached, 3 years of proving beyond any reasonable statistical doubt that Jim Schwartz was not just a capable coordinator, but one of the premier defensive minds working in professional football. And the Cleveland Browns looked at all of that, looked at all those years of elite production, looked at the record-breaking performances and the historic statistical achievements and the development of players at every level of the defense, and decided to pass him over. They chose to go in a different direction. They chose an offensive-minded head coach, Todd Monken, and in doing so, sent a message to their defensive coordinator that was impossible to misread. Jim Schwartz was measured in how he talked about it publicly. He was careful, he was professional, he was, by his own description, disappointed rather than angry, let down rather than bitter. But even through the careful, considered language of a 33-year NFL veteran who understands how this business works and has seen its cold logic applied enough times to know better than to take it personally, the truth of what happened was unmistakably clear. He had done his job at the highest possible level. He had delivered results that most organizations would have been desperate to hold on to. He had proven himself worthy of the opportunity he was being denied, and the Cleveland Browns said no. And here's where Schwartz said something that every person in every professional field, not just football, can understand on a deeply human level. He said that anyone who has worked in any business, who has performed at a high level, who genuinely did excellent work and who believed they were in line for a promotion, knows what it feels like to be passed over, knows what it does to your ability to continue operating effectively in that environment afterward. He said he couldn't stay, not because he was being dramatic, not because he was throwing a tantrum, but because the practical reality of remaining on that staff as a defensive coordinator who had just been told by his own organization that his performance wasn't quite enough to justify the top job would have poisoned everything.
His authority with the players, his ability to command the room, his relationship with a new head coach who deserved to have his own people around him, rather than a coordinator whose loyalty and whose standing in the building were complicated by what had just happened. All of it would have been compromised. Schwartz recognized that. He's been in the league 33 years. He's seen what arranged marriages between coaching staffs produce. He wasn't going to let it happen to him or to Todd Monken or to the players who had invested in the defensive system he'd built. So he resigned, and in resigning, he accepted that he would have to sit out the following season as a result, a professional and financial consequence that is not trivial for someone who has been working at the highest level of professional football for over 3 decades. He accepted that consequence because the alternative was worse, and the fact that he eventually sat down for an exclusive interview to tell his side of the story tells you that even with all that acceptance, even with all that professional equanimity, something about how this went down continued to bother him enough that he needed the record corrected. That's not nothing. That is a man with tremendous professional pride telling you, carefully and clearly, that what happened in Cleveland was not okay.
After the September loss, Smesko had a choice. Take the first-round exit as a painful but instructive learning experience, maybe make some changes, refresh the roster, rebuild towards something different. That's what most front offices do when a favored team goes home in the first round. You shake it up. You tell yourself it was a fluke, and then quietly change enough things that it doesn't feel like you're just running it back with the same group that failed. Smesko didn't do that. He refused to blow it up. He went into a brutal, compressed free agency window, fought for every dollar, and re-signed Alicia Gray. He brought Ryan Howard back. He kept the core together. He held on to the group that lost and told anyone who would listen that he wanted to run it back with the same people, the same identity, the same vision. You don't make that call unless something is eating at you. You don't pay to keep a group together after a first-round upset unless that upset is the specific thing keeping you awake in the offseason. Dan Padover, who won Executive of the Year for his work, went along with that vision. They spent real money in a league where spending real money is never a casual decision. They made it happen because the group that lost believed, collectively, that they hadn't actually been beaten by a better team. They'd been beaten by a moment, and they wanted the chance to prove the difference. Thursday night is that chance. Indiana is walking in trying to figure out who it is. Atlanta already knows. 8 months of preparation, a held-together core, and a front office that refused to move on are all walking through that door at Gainbridge. The asymmetry and motivation between these two teams is as sharp as anything you'll see in the league this season. Here's the angle that's getting lost in all the noise about team meetings and leaked quotes and sideline confrontations. Indiana is the defending Commissioner's Cup champions. They hold that trophy. It's the one piece of hardware they can point to right now. And this game counts toward Commissioner's Cup standings, the way every game in this stretch does. So, on top of everything else, the identity crisis, the defensive limitations, the national television audience, the personal grudge Atlanta is carrying, Indiana is also playing to defend the one title they've actually won, against the team in the East that is specifically constructed to take it. That's not a footnote. That's a meaningful layer of stakes sitting underneath an already loaded game. Contending teams don't hold emergency 2-hour meetings in early June. They don't walk onto the floor against the league's second-ranked defense with a single coverage in the bag and hope the offense covers the gap. But here Indiana is, defending a title, navigating a fractured locker room, and trying to find themselves on the biggest stage of the week. Atlanta isn't coming to Gainbridge to find anything. They already found it. They found it 8 months ago on a night that still hasn't fully left them, and they've been building toward this moment ever since. Strip everything else away. Forget the leaked meeting details for a moment. Forget the sideline footage that went viral. Forget the question marks and the qualifying statements and the carefully worded denials. Get down to what Thursday actually is in its simplest form. One team is walking into that building having spent 8 months sharpening for exactly this night. They have their entire core intact. Their best player is healthy and hungry. Their defense is the second best in the league and built specifically to dismantle high-scoring offenses. They lost in September in a way that still burns, and they've been holding that flame carefully ever since. Every practice rep, every film session, every dollar spent in free agency has been quietly aimed at this rematch. Atlanta already knows who it is. That question was answered long ago. The other team spent last Monday locked in a 2-hour meeting that the whole sport is now talking about. They're 4-4. They have one defensive coverage. Their star player spent the week doing damage control on a sideline confrontation instead of game prep. Their key veteran is publicly wondering whether this is the thing that breaks them or makes them. Their offense is elite and their defense is a problem with no quick fix coming. And they have to do this on national television, in their own building, in front of the fans who expect them to be a championship-level team, while being very clearly right now something short of that.
Think about what that means in context. You've already lost your defensive coordinator, one of the premier defensive minds in the NFL, under circumstances significant enough to generate a public exclusive interview. Your best defensive player is reportedly frustrated and operating in a complicated relationship with the front office. And now you're potentially moving another defensive starter, not for an equivalent player, not for an immediate upgrade elsewhere on the roster, but for draft picks, for future selections, for assets that won't be cashed in for years. This is not a competitive team making competitive decisions. This is a franchise deliberately and methodically dismantling its present competitive infrastructure in favor of building toward a future that they are clearly prioritizing over the present one. And when you put those 3 data points together, Schwartz out, Garrett frustrated, Ward potentially traded for picks, the pattern that emerges is not subtle, it is not ambiguous, it does not require creative interpretation or speculative leaps to understand what it means. The Cleveland Browns are in a full organizational rebuild. Not a retooling, not a transitional period where they're making some changes while staying competitive. A wholesale, top-to-bottom rebuild of the roster, the coaching staff, the organizational philosophy, and the competitive timeline that is designed to position this franchise for a future chapter that has not yet arrived, rather than compete meaningfully in the present one that is happening right now. And that rebuild is happening inside a specific context that makes it even more significant and even more revealing about what is truly driving organizational decision-making at the ownership level. The Cleveland Browns are preparing to move into a new stadium, and anyone who has watched NFL franchises navigate stadium transitions over the years knows what kind of move does to organizational priorities. New stadiums change everything. They alter revenue forecasts in ways that reshape how ownership thinks about the competitive timeline. They change the organizational calculus about when to spend and when to accumulate. They create incentive structures that, from a pure business perspective, can make a short-term sacrifice of competitive performance rational and even strategically sound, even when it is genuinely damaging from a competitive standpoint and genuinely harmful from a human standpoint for the players and coaches who are caught inside that transition window. The stadium context doesn't excuse what's happening in Cleveland, but it explains it. It explains why an organization that had the most statistically dominant defense in the NFL for 3 consecutive years is making the decisions it is making right now, because the people making those decisions are not purely optimizing for winning in 2025 or 2026. They're optimizing for something larger, something longer term, something that is tied to a new building and a new revenue structure and a new chapter of the franchise's history that they are actively and deliberately engineering toward. And the competitive consequences for the present roster, the present coaching staff, and the present players are collateral damage in that larger organizational project. Which brings us to the part of this story that is the most uncomfortable, the most painful, and the most important to address honestly.
because right in the middle of all of this organizational turbulence, right at the center of a rebuild that is consuming competitive assets and sacrificing present performance for future positioning, there is a young quarterback who deserves better than what he is getting. Shedeur Sanders. If you've been following this story, you know the numbers. You know that his licensing royalties broke Tom Brady's historic commercial record, generating $17.7 million. You know that Miles Garrett, the most credible voice in that locker room, publicly said that Shedeur is the guy in the eyes of the Cleveland Browns defense. You know that the attention and the excitement and the cultural momentum that followed Shedeur Sanders from Colorado through the draft process and into his first NFL season created a level of public investment in his story that is genuinely rare for a rookie quarterback entering an uncertain organizational situation. People bought in. People saw the potential. People heard Miles Garrett say he's the guy and believed that the organization felt the same way. But here's the question that the Jim Schwartz interview, placed in the full context of everything else happening around this Cleveland Browns franchise, forces every honest observer to ask directly, does the organization actually feel that way? Or is Shedeur Sanders, for all the commercial excitement and all the public expressions of support from teammates, operating inside an organizational environment that has never truly committed to building around him as its long-term competitive answer at quarterback?
Look at the evidence. The Browns are in a full rebuild, stockpiling draft picks and shedding present competitive assets. They are running a quarterback competition that, given the organizational context, is getting harder and harder to defend as a genuine evaluation of who gives them the best chance to win, rather than a managed situation designed to preserve flexibility. They lost the defensive coordinator who built the system around their best player, and that best player is frustrated. They are potentially trading another defensive starter for more future picks. Every single one of these decisions points away from a franchise that is committed to developing and maximizing a young quarterback in the present. Every single one of them points toward an organization that is playing a longer game, a game whose final shape may or may not include the quarterback that fans are currently most invested in. This is the devastating reality at the center of the Jim Schwartz story. Because Schwartz's interview isn't ultimately about Jim Schwartz. It isn't about one coordinator's professional grievance or one man's account of how an organizational decision affected his career. It is a window into the culture, the priorities, and the decision-making process of an organization that has now made a series of interrelated choices, all pointing in the same direction, all telling the same story about where Cleveland is headed and what they are truly prioritizing. And that story has enormous implications for the young man under center who has been told he is the future, while the evidence suggests that future may be being built without him at the center of it. Shedeur Sanders did not earn the right to be a placeholder. He did not generate $17.7 million in commercial royalties. He did not command the support of Miles Garrett. He did not carry the weight of an entire fan base's hopes and expectations to be the quarterback of a rebuild that was never truly designed around him. He deserves to be in an organization where the defensive coordinator sticks around because the commitment to winning is genuine enough that the people contributing to that winning have real reason to stay. He deserves to be in an organization where the best defensive player isn't quietly frustrated at front office decisions, but is fully bought in and fully committed to the shared goal of competing at the highest level. He deserves to be somewhere the draft capital being accumulated is being spent on adding competitive pieces around a quarterback the organization truly believes in, rather than being stockpiled as part of a long-term rebuild that may or may not have him at its center when it finally reaches the stage where it's ready to compete. There are people who will read all of this and look for reasons to push back, who will say that individual decisions need to be evaluated individually rather than as part of a pattern, who will say that rebuilds are necessary, that organizations have to make hard choices, that losing Schwartz and potentially moving Ward and accumulating draft picks are each defensible in isolation, and that connecting them into a single narrative is unfair to the organization. And there is a version of that argument that contains a kernel of reasonable perspective. Individual transactions do need to be evaluated on their own merits. Organizations do sometimes have to make uncomfortable decisions in the service of a larger strategic vision. But here is the problem with that pushback. The decisions being made in Cleveland are not happening in isolation. They are happening in sequence, in a specific direction, with a specific pattern of prioritization that is consistent across every single one of them. Every decision points away from present competition and toward future positioning. Every decision sacrifices a present competitive asset for future capital or future flexibility. Every decision sends the same message about where the organizational timeline sits right now and what the people running this franchise believe about their own ability to compete in the next 2 years. When the pattern is that consistent, when the direction is that clear, when decision after decision after decision all point the same way, at some point the argument that each one needs to be evaluated in isolation becomes an argument for willful blindness, and the Jim Schwartz interview, the account of a credible 33-year NFL veteran who was inside that building when the decisions were being made, is the piece that converts a pattern of circumstantial evidence into something much closer to confirmed organizational reality. Cleveland is not going to be a serious contender in the next 2 years. That is the honest conclusion. That is what the evidence, taken in totality and looked at without the comfort of convenient explanations that let the organization off the hook for decisions that are having real consequences for real people, mandates. They are rebuilding. They are revamping. They are preparing for a new stadium and a new chapter and a new organizational identity whose shape is being determined right now by decisions that are prioritizing future positioning over present competitive performance. And Jim Schwartz speaking publicly about what happened inside that building is the piece that gives the entire picture its clearest, most definitive shape.
So here is where we land. Here is the honest, unvarnished, undiplomatic conclusion that all of this evidence points toward. A franchise that loses its defensive coordinator under circumstances compelling enough to generate an exclusive public interview is a franchise with a culture problem at the decision-making level. A franchise whose best defensive player is operating in a complicated and frustrated relationship with the front office is a franchise that is not managing its most important relationships with the care and the respect that those relationships deserve. A franchise that is reportedly trading away defensive starters for draft picks while simultaneously running a quarterback competition of questionable competitive integrity is a franchise that is not seriously trying to win in the immediate future. A franchise that is hoarding draft capital, shedding competitive assets, and operating within the context of a new stadium build that changes its ownership priorities is a franchise in full rebuild mode. And a franchise in full rebuild mode is not the right environment for a young quarterback whose development window is happening right now, whose commercial momentum and public profile and teammate support are all peaking right now, and who deserves to be in a place that is as committed to his success as he is. The Jim Schwartz interview is going to generate enormous attention. It should. It deserves every moment of it, not because it's a salacious story about internal drama, but because it is a credible, first-hand account that puts a face and a voice in a lived experience behind what has otherwise been a pattern of organizational decisions that speak for themselves, loudly, but that some people have been willing to explain away as coincidence or necessity. It's not coincidence, it's not necessity, it's a franchise making a deliberate series of choices that reflect a deliberate set of organizational priorities that are not centered on competing seriously in the next 2 years.
And Shedeur Sanders, Miles Garrett, Denzel Ward, and every other player currently inside that building deserves to know that clearly and honestly, rather than being managed through a process designed to maintain the appearance of competitive ambition while the organizational decisions tell a completely different story. The picture is complete now. Jim Schwartz spoke, and in speaking, confirmed what the pattern of decisions had been saying for months. Cleveland is in a rebuild. The competitive window they appeared to be approaching under Schwartz's defensive dominance has been closed, not by external forces, not by injuries or by the unpredictable chaos of an NFL season, but by organizational choices made at the highest level of the franchise by the people whose job it is to set the direction of this team. Those choices have consequences. They have consequences for Jim Schwartz, who deserved better than being passed over after 3 years of the best defensive football in the league. They have consequences for Miles Garrett, who deserved to have the organizational infrastructure around him that his performance earned and that his talent requires to operate at its peak. They have consequences for Shedeur Sanders, who deserved to enter a franchise fully committed to building around him, rather than one in the middle of a rebuild whose true timeline may extend well beyond the years when he is young and developing and most in need of the right environment to become what he is capable of becoming. And they have consequences for the fans, the people who showed up, who bought the jerseys, who watched those 45 consecutive games without a 300-yard passing performance against their defense and allowed themselves to believe that this was the beginning of something real and sustainable and worth investing in. Those people deserved a franchise that was as committed to building on that foundation as they were to supporting it. Instead, they got an organization that dismantled the architect of that foundation, frustrated its cornerstone player, and is now rebuilding toward a future that hasn't been honest enough with anyone about what that future actually looks like and who is truly going to be at the center of it. Jim Schwartz said what needed to be said. He put the accurate version of events on the record. He did what people with credibility and professional integrity do when the alternative is allowing a false or incomplete narrative to define something that mattered. Now the question is, what Cleveland does with all of it? Whether the people making decisions inside that building hear the message, not just from Schwartz, not just from the reporters and the analysts and the observers, but from the players themselves, from the franchise player who is frustrated, from the rookie quarterback who deserves better, from the entire situation that is developing right in front of everyone who is paying attention. Because the one thing that is absolutely certain right now is that the path Cleveland is on is not the path toward the kind of franchise that anyone associated with it should want this to be. And the longer they stay on it without course correcting, without being honest about what they are actually doing and what it means for the people inside that building, the more damage gets done to the roster, to the culture, to the players, and to whatever future they are actually trying to build. Stay locked in, because this story is not finished, not even close.